When you think of punk music, a few things probably come to mind: power chords, hairspray, safety pins, and of course rebellion. Originally, punk was created as a response to the authority in the mainstream in the UK at the time. Individuals were fed up with how the country was being run politically and decided to rebel musically. Due to the nature of the individuals choosing to make this music, they weren't exactly classically trained musicians, which gives punk rock its signature sound: power chords, fast-paced drums, and rudimentary raw vocals. As punk began to spread to other locations, the message and ideology was diluted somewhat, sometimes into something good, other times very, very bad. One of the locations I find most interesting is Soviet Russia, which involves a government who went directly against the expansion of the punk scene, resulting in a sort of war between underground music and punk and the Soviet Union. In order to understand the Russian punk scene in the late 70s and early 80s, we first need to go back and explore the Soviet Union's relationship with music as a whole in the decades prior. In the post-World War II Soviet Union, Western music was completely outlawed, with it being described not only as being created to spread capitalist and imperialist messages, but also being downright devil music. This meant any individual living under Soviet rule was forced to travel to specific locations to listen to one of the few American radio stations promoting American propaganda, as well as playing Western rock and roll. Although this was incredibly niche and obviously heavily cracked down upon, it still reached the ears of many under Soviet rule, which resulted in black markets forming specifically for the distribution of rock and roll. If you use your brain for about 4.5 seconds, some questions may form in your head. Obviously, vinyl was the main way to consume and distribute music around this time, and a vinyl record is about the size of a dinner plate. How did music fans under Soviet rule keep these vinyls hidden? Surely the size would result in them getting caught with what is seen as illegal materials at the time. The solution to this is not only genius, but impressive, and honestly seems like a lot of work just to listen to the Beatles ramble about tax. Music fans within the country realised they could press vinyl onto X-ray film, essentially creating a flexi disc, meaning these bendy discs could be stored anywhere and easily hidden. This meant that records were being printed onto already used X-ray sheets, often featuring images of broken bones. Seems foolproof, but you seem to forget, similar to the time you were sold a bag of broccoli, a lot of these discs were fake and just created to make a quick buck. Although, I hate to admit it, the Beatles did result in a cultural shift, which was recognised by the Soviet Union, who began to sanction rock bands, which saw a few local Soviet bands pop up around the country. These bands were all obviously heavily regulated by the Soviet Union, resulting in what was essentially propaganda with power chords. What the Soviets didn't realise is not only would this inspire the youth to dig deeper into the black markets for the sound of real rock and roll, it would rally them up into a frenzy to form bands and make music outside of the regulated scene. Although unofficial bands began to form, they were all kind of stuck. Bands who weren't endorsed by the state couldn't really do anything, and if they tried, the consequences were pretty dire. At this point, the youth culture in the Soviet Union had never really been victorious against the state in a form of protest, at least nothing too meaningful, meaning fear was still very much rampant. This would change in 1978. The state were trying to force Georgia to use the language Russian as their official native tongue. 20,000 university students took to the streets protesting against the decision, deciding to march towards the government house in Georgia. Although the militia were able to block some of the protesters, 5,000 still broke through and reached the government building. As rumours of violence began to spread, the state decided to backtrack, leaving Georgian as the native tongue in the country. Not only did this protest eventually lead to Georgian independence in the 90s, but showed the youth under Soviet rule that they were able to fight for what they wanted, which basically exploded the underground punk scene throughout the Soviet-ruled countries. What differentiated Soviet punk from Western counterparts was much of the message and ideology. English punks protested and fought against the English conservative and upper class. Soviet punks realised everyone was pretty much equally poor, so adopted a more us versus the world mentality. The Western punk scene had begun inserting its way into Soviet Russia, especially Moscow, resulting in many of the same trends being adopted, although altered slightly due to the limitations of the Soviet regime. Doc Martens were replaced with military boots, whilst the classic punk leather jacket was replaced by anything found within the Voentorg military supply chain. As you can imagine, the Soviet state absolutely hated the movement and immediately pushed out various pieces of Soviet propaganda accusing Western punk bands of aggression and hate. The Soviet propaganda went specifically hard on the use of a recognisable symbol that looked similar to a Buddhist symbol of peace, and decided to censor many of the upcoming punk rock bands. Another clear reason punk and underground music as a whole was so vilified in the Soviet Union links back to the protests in Georgia I mentioned earlier. The state saw it fit that a large music festival was announced to try and get the youth back on their side. They would even allow underground bands not regulated by the state to play at this event. This resulted in the Russian rock band Aquarium performing at the festival and going on to perform various acts that I can't speak about on YouTube, acts that were completely illegal in Soviet Union at the time. YouTube's limited ad system definitely doesn't resemble the Soviet Union censorship, and that's an obvious joke, YouTube, that is an obvious joke. This resulted in Aquarium being banned and blacklisted. Although Aquarium weren't musically punk, this event still affected the scene immensely. The state cracked down on all rock music, especially punk. What they didn't expect, however, is anything that gets banned becomes immediately 10 times cooler to any crusty individual. What is commonly seen as one of the earliest Soviet punk bands would be, sorry if I butcher this, I'm not even going to try, just this.
Автоматическое удовлетворитель.
Or Automatic Satisfiers, formed in 1979. The band would originally be forced to play early shows in private apartments, although eventually were able to join an official rock club, meaning they could play on actual stages. Of course, this is punk, which means there has to be a little bit of on-stage degeneracy, with a lot of wee-wee and pee-pee being utilised at their shows. Around the same time, the band DK, which can apparently stand for many things, each being worse than the last and none of them meaning Dead Kennedys, would form in Moscow. DK would push forward the punk formula, essentially creating a form of art punk, combining blues and free jazz with obviously punk. They also absolutely hated the Soviets. Punk scenes were forming all over Russia, even outside the major cities. Siberia saw its own punk scene develop, with bands who had to deal with much stricter censorship than their contemporaries within the larger cities. This was specifically bad for the band, I'm just doing this again,
Гражданская оборона.
also known as Grob. The band was formed by punk rock legend Igor Letov. As Grob began to see some popularity, Letov was politically repressed and labelled as socially dangerous. This meant he was forcefully placed in a mental hospital for 3 months. Due to his failure to comply to pretty much any of the demands of the hospital staff, he almost went blind due to the drugs he was given. Letov's story is pretty vast, and for some reason, 1 in every 10 suggestions I get is for a video on this dude, so I'll probably save the majority of it for another time. The Soviet underground music scene would quickly evolve into more New Order style post-punk, although still very much had the attitude of more traditional punk. Vova Blue and the Brothers of Mind would spearhead this music, self-distributing tapes around Russia. They were from a town that wasn't even on any map, so the fact that they were able to cement themselves in Soviet culture was pretty amazing. This obviously influenced many other bands to do the same, continually making it harder and harder for the state to get their grubby mitts into the production of music. Too many projects were being distributed for the censorship to work in full effect. Illegal gigs were still being held, with the KGB being forced to only arrest individuals who couldn't control their emotions, whatever that means. Much like a lot of the literature produced at the time in Soviet Russia, the lyricism within much of the music remains incredibly complex and intelligent. This links directly to the censorship. Anything too on the nose could risk a trip to the gulag. Songwriters had to intelligently insert any sort of rebellion behind metaphors. Underground bands were beginning to bubble up to the forefront of Soviet culture. This was originally thought to be a victory for the artists by the artists. What they didn't realise is that the Soviet leader at the time, Leonid Brezhnev, had a soft spot for the youth culture and had slowly been allowing more of it through the censors. When Brezhnev passed away, his replacements immediately sought to gain control over the youth once again, and many of the bands within the underground scene were either arrested or just simply disappeared. We kind of all know the story from here. Soviet Union falls in 1991, punk eventually becomes this. It isn't really something I need to go over in detail. What remains consistently interesting about underground music, and specifically punk, is the effect it seemed to have on every country it stuck its grubby little fingers into. It's a genre of music that allows individuals disgruntled with the state of their country, life or surroundings to push that anger into music, which more often than not results in real change, or at the very least promotes fear in the hearts of the leaders, often causing the issues. Also, why the f*** were so many world leaders and politicians scared of this? Like they were scared of this, just like ban Hairspray, I don't know.